When you imagine the city of Tenochtitlan rising from the waters of Lake Texcoco, perhaps you picture temples and warriors, sacrifices and conquests. Yet beneath those towering pyramids and ceremonial drums, there was another world, quieter, slower, and more fragrant. It was the world of flowers, gardens tended with patience, irrigation channels carefully adjusted by hand, and blossoms that perfumed the courtyards of nobles. To walk through an Aztec palace was not only to hear chants and see murals, but to smell marigold, magnolia, and the bitter-sweet trace of cacao prepared for drinking. This was no accident. The Aztec world was designed to carry fragrance, and the courtyards themselves became theatres of smell. The gardens were not afterthoughts. They were deliberate, as important to nobility as jade, feather cloaks, or gold ornaments. The very word xochitl, flower, was heavy with meaning in Nahuatl. Flowers were the language of poetry, of diplomacy, of prayer. The Aztecs considered them gifts from the gods, ephemeral and fragile, but also signs of truth. The phrase in Xochitl and Cuicatl, flower and song, meant wisdom and beauty, the way of expressing the deepest truths in a world where all else withered. To cultivate a courtyard garden, then, was not simply to decorate. It was to create a living manuscript of fragrance, a place where power and philosophy met. In the courtyards of nobles you might find rows of marigolds, their yellow petals thick with resinous scent, planted not just for beauty but for ritual use. Marigolds were used in offerings, in ceremonies for the dead, and as medicine. Beside them might stand the white blossoms of magnolia trees, heavy and waxy, their scent carried on the breeze to mingle with the perfume of lilies. Gardens in Tenochtitlan were not arranged haphazardly. They were cultivated with irrigation, with careful paths of water directed by hand or with simple tools, feeding the soil carried onto the chinampas and into palace grounds. To maintain such gardens required constant work. Servants swept the courtyards daily, clearing fallen leaves, petals and dust. For Aztec nobles valued cleanliness as a sign of order. The soil was replenished with lake mud and compost, gathered from canals and refuse heaps. It is said that Moctezuma's gardens at Chapultepec were stocked with hundreds of plant species, some brought from far beyond the Valley of Mexico, carried by tribute and trade. Courtyards were smaller reflections of these royal collections, microcosms of fragrance and colour. You might pause and notice that such cultivation was not merely luxury, it was also politics. To command flowers from distant provinces was to show dominion, to say that the empire could summon beauty as easily as tribute grain. As you walk in imagination through these courtyards, you hear the crunch of gravel underfoot, the sound of water dripping from an irrigation trough. Somewhere nearby, a servant grinds cacao on a metate, and the bitter scent rises into the courtyard, mingling with the perfume of flowers. This was daily life, not silence, not grandeur, but a tapestry of small labours, each one adding to the sensory richness of Aztec nobility. Cacao was not just for drinking, it was currency. To smell it in the courtyard was to be reminded of wealth, of power, of a drink prepared only for elites. Frothy chocolate, spiced with chili or sweetened with honey, was a symbol of prestige, and its preparation often filled the courtyards with the faint smell of roasted beans. You might think this was excessive, but consider the Aztec view of the senses. They believed smell was not trivial, it was tied to the soul. Pleasant fragrance was considered divine, while foul odours were signs of corruption, decay, or sin. Thus courtyards filled with flowers were more than pleasure, they were moral statements. A noble's courtyard was a reflection of his purity, his alignment with the gods. To neglect fragrance would have been to neglect the very meaning of nobility. But behind the fragrance lay labour. Gardeners, often commoners in service, spent hours weeding, watering and transplanting delicate flowers. Cacao had to be imported from warmer southern regions, carried in sacks by porters who walked miles along causeways and roads. Magnolia seeds and orchid roots were traded, planted and carefully tended in pots. Every flower in the courtyard carried with it a web of labour, tribute and travel. The noble who strolled through the garden was surrounded by unseen hands, the quiet work of thousands beyond the walls of Tenochtitlan. Pause and picture this. The morning sun just breaking across the city, mist rising from Lake Texcoco. In a noble's courtyard the air is cool, damp, scented with the night-blooming flowers that still linger. Servants sweep the stones with brooms made of twigs. In one corner, a small basin reflects the light, its surface disturbed by ripples as water drips steadily from a channel. At the centre, rows of flowers await the touch of sunlight to open wider. In the distance, you hear the faint call of market vendors preparing their goods. The city is waking, and yet here, in this enclosed space, time feels suspended. This was what the courtyards offered, a pocket of calm in a city of thousands, a breath between rituals and wars. Still, one must not romanticize too quickly. Gardens were status symbols. Commoners rarely had the resources to cultivate courtyards of flowers. Their spaces were functional, plots for maize, beans, chilies. The fragrance of flowers and cacao was therefore a privilege of the elite. To walk into such a courtyard was to step into a world designed to exclude. The fragrance itself became a marker of class. To smell magnolia in bloom was to know you stood in the presence of someone powerful. In this sense, fragrance was as political as banners or shields. It is worth noting that the Aztec Empire in its height was obsessed with order. Tribute lists, calendars, codices, all catalogued and controlled. The courtyards mirrored this order, each plant assigned its place, each path swept clean. To you, today, the detail may seem mundane, how often the stones were washed, how many hands swept the petals each morning. But in the Aztec worldview, such boring tasks were the foundation of empire. If the courtyard smelled of flowers and chocolate, it was because countless boring hours were spent ensuring they did. And yet, within this boring detail, one finds the philosophy of the Aztecs. For them, life was fleeting. Flowers bloomed and withered, chocolate was consumed and gone. To tend to these fleeting things was to practice awareness of transience. Poets sang of flowers because they represented truth, brief, fragrant, and gone. In this way, the noble courtyard was not only a display of wealth, but a meditation on impermanence. The fragrance you smell today would be gone tomorrow, replaced by another bloom, another grinding of cacao. To walk in the courtyard was to walk in time itself, to sense the passing of the world through the senses of smell and taste. So imagine yourself standing there in the courtyard of a noble in Tenochtitlan. The flowers surround you, each carefully placed. The air is full of mingled fragrance, bitter cacao, sweet magnolia, resinous marigold. Servants move quietly, unseen, their labours constant. You breathe deeply, and you know that you're not simply smelling a garden, you're smelling an empire, its tribute networks, its philosophy, its obsession with order and impermanence. But here, one question lingers. If fragrance was so central to Aztec life, what happened when the fragrance faded, when drought struck, when tribute failed, or when the empire itself began to crumble? If Section 1 led you through the fragrance of an Aztec courtyard, Section 2 turns your gaze outward to the networks that made such fragrance possible. For a single blossom in Tenochtitlan was never only a blossom, it was the end point of tribute systems, trade routes, and obligations. Every flower, every cacao bean in those courtyards was a silent witness to a long chain of labour stretching across Mesoamerica. The Empire of the Mexica, which you call the Aztecs, was held together not only by armies but by tribute. Provinces under Aztec rule sent goods to the capital. Food, cloth, obsidian, feathers, even warriors for sacrifice. Among the most curious items demanded was fragrance itself. Tribute lists from codices mention bundles of cacao, garlands of flowers, and even feathers arranged with aromatic resins. Imagine this, a province hundreds of miles away, preparing a shipment of blossoms to send to Tenochtitlan, knowing that the very act of gathering fragrance was a political duty. The noble who strolled through his courtyard smelled not only beauty but also power, the reach of the empire into distant valleys and coasts. Cacao was particularly significant. It did not grow well in the high altitude of the Valley of Mexico. It belonged to warmer, more humid lands, Chiapas, the Gulf Coast, the Soconusco region. To bring cacao beans into Tenochtitlan required tribute caravans, porters travelling days, sometimes weeks, with sacks on their backs. The beans were valuable enough to serve as money, so valuable that counterfeit beans, made of clay and painted, sometimes circulated. In a noble courtyard, when you smelled the roasting of cacao, you were inhaling not only aroma but also the flow of wealth. Each bean was a small coin, a unit of power, a reminder of subjugated provinces. The tribute system was relentless. Codex Mendoza records that certain towns were required to send 20 baskets of cacao every 80 days, along with elaborate flower garlands. Picture the journey: men bent under the weight of sacks, climbing ridges, following narrow causeways, trudging toward the heart of the empire. By the time the beans reached Tenochtitlan, they were heavy with the sweat of labour. Yet in the courtyard, this was invisible. The noble saw only the servant grinding cacao, frothing it into a drink, filling the air with fragrance. Behind that fragrance lay countless footsteps. Flowers followed similar paths. In the high valley, many species thrived, but nobles desired the rarest, the most delicate, the blossoms from faraway lands. Orchids were treasured, their roots used for flavouring chocolate, their blooms admired for delicacy. Magnolia, with its thick white petals, carried associations of purity and nobility. Marigolds were common, but when woven into garlands or arranged in ritual bundles, they became tokens of reverence. Tribute required them in quantity. Provinces near the Gulf sent baskets of fragrant herbs, which nobles burned as incense in their courtyards. Again, the fragrance was a sign of reach. It declared, "This empire gathers not only food and gold, but even the air itself." Yet fragrance was not purely political. It was also deeply spiritual. In Nahua poetry, flowers are described as the breath of the gods. A blossom offered on an altar was thought to release its fragrance upward, pleasing the divine. Cacao, too, was sacred. The god Quetzalcoatl, it was said, had given cacao to humans as a gift. To drink it was to drink the wisdom of creation. Thus, when nobles filled their courtyards with flowers and cacao, they were not only displaying wealth, but reenacting a cosmic drama. The fragrance reminded them of divine order. To neglect it would have been to risk imbalance. Still, we must remember the other side of this order. Tribute was not freely given, it was extracted. For every blossom enjoyed in Tenochtitlan, there were hands that plucked it under obligation. For every cacao bean ground in the courtyard, there was a porter who had carried it, unpaid except by duty. The nobles, in breathing their perfumed courtyards, breathed also the labour of subjugated peoples, and this labour was endless, repetitive, boring even. Imagine women in distant villages weaving garlands every 80 days, as the calendar demanded, knowing they would never see the courtyards where their flowers ended. Imagine porters loading sack after sack of cacao, step after step, their labour invisible in the final aroma. Yet invisibility was part of the system. Nobles preferred it so. The courtyard smelled of peace, order, divinity. To acknowledge the sweat and dust that produced it would have spoiled the illusion. Fragrance thus became a kind of mask covering the empire's harsher truths. You, standing in that courtyard, would not see the tribute caravans. You would not hear the grumbling of conquered peoples. You would only smell magnolia and chocolate and believe in the empire's greatness. But there were cracks in this illusion. The system depended on constant flow. If tribute was disrupted by drought, rebellion, or war, the fragrance in the courtyards faltered. Codices record times when provinces resisted tribute, refusing to send goods. Imagine the silence in a noble courtyard then, the absence of chocolate being ground, the wilt of flowers when replacements did not arrive. Fragrance so carefully cultivated could vanish in an instant, and with it the sense of order. This fragility gave fragrance attention. It was abundant, but precarious. Nobles enjoyed it as if eternal, yet always feared its loss. That is why they devoted such care to maintaining gardens within the city itself. Tribute brought rare species, but local gardens provided daily blossoms. Courtyards were stocked with plants that could survive the high valley climate tended constantly by gardeners. The empire might falter, but the courtyard had to smell of flowers, for if it did not, what would it say of nobility? What would it say of empire? The symbolism went deeper still. To the Aztecs, the body itself was a kind of courtyard. They believed that just as a noble's courtyard should be perfumed and pure, so should the body. Bathing was frequent. Steam baths were common. Perfumed ointments were applied, especially for the elite. A foul-smelling body was a sign of disorder, weakness, even sin. Thus, the courtyard and the body reflected each other. To breathe fragrance was to align body and cosmos, self and empire. This belief elevated even the smallest blossom in a noble courtyard into a marker of cosmic truth. Pause again, and imagine yourself seated in such a courtyard. You sip the frothy chocolate, spiced with chili, its aroma mingling with the flowers around you. A noble speaks softly nearby, his words filled with metaphor, comparing flowers to truths, chocolate to wisdom. Servants sweep the stones, arrange garlands, replenish the basins with fresh water. Outside, beyond the palace walls, caravans arrive with tribute, their porters weary, their baskets filled with blossoms and beans. But here, you see only the surface, the calm fragrance of empire distilled into one space. And yet, perhaps you notice the fragility. Perhaps you wonder, how long could such a system last, balanced on the endless flow of tribute and the labour of others? Could a world built on fragrance withstand the storms of conquest and rebellion? Could a courtyard of flowers resist the winds of history? The courtyards of Tenochtitlan, once filled with blossoms and the aroma of cacao, did not vanish overnight. But with the coming of the Spanish, their fragrance was slowly replaced by another smell: smoke, gunpowder, and the dust of ruins. To understand how these gardens ended, you must walk once more through their fragrance and then imagine its fading, step by step. When Hernán Cortés and his men entered Tenochtitlan in 1519, they were stunned. The city seemed to float on water, its causeways stretching across the lake, its palaces gleaming with white plaster. Among the marvels they recorded were the gardens, both at Chapultepec, Moctezuma's great estate, and within the courtyards of noble houses. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of the conquistadors, wrote in awe of the aviaries, the ponds, the fragrant plants gathered from across the empire. To men hardened by marches and war, these courtyards seemed like visions. They smelled flowers they had never known, tasted chocolate for the first time, and were astonished at its bitterness and froth. What to the Aztecs was daily life was to the Spaniards a revelation. But admiration quickly turned to conquest. The tribute networks that supplied flowers and cacao began to collapse under war. Provinces saw a chance to resist, joining Spaniards against Tenochtitlan. Tribute caravans ceased. The courtyards, once replenished regularly with blossoms and beans, began to falter. Servants still tended what they could, sweeping the stones, watering the plants, grinding what cacao remained. Yet the abundance faded. Imagine a courtyard where the garlands are fewer, the cacao bowls smaller, the fragrance thinner. Even before the city fell, the scent of empire was weakening. Then came the siege of 1521. Spanish cannons fired into the city, brigantines cut off its canals, famine spread. The courtyards, those fragile theatres of fragrance, were trampled, burned, abandoned. Water channels clogged with debris, gardens withered without tending. The courtyards, once symbols of order, became ruins of neglect. The fragrance of magnolia and cacao gave way to the acrid stench of hunger, disease and smoke. In the eyes of survivors, the end of fragrance was the end of a world. And yet fragrance did not disappear entirely. Certain flowers persisted. Marigolds continued to grow in the valley, used in rituals for the dead. Chocolate endured, though transformed. Sweetened with sugar by Spaniards, adapted to European tastes. The courtyards of nobles were rebuilt in colonial style, but the memory of fragrance lingered. In noir poetry recorded after the conquest, you hear laments for lost gardens, for flowers that once bloomed in abundance, for songs and scents, silenced. "We are crushed to the ground," one poem declares. "Our flowers have been scattered." These were not just metaphors, they were literal. The fragrance of empire was gone. But history does not erase so cleanly. Even today in Mexico, fragrance carries memory. The use of marigolds in Dia de los Muertos, their bright petals guiding spirits, is a direct survival of pre-Hispanic practice. Chocolate remains central, now sweetened but still tied to ritual and hospitality. The courtyards of colonial houses with their central fountains and potted flowers echo the spaces once perfumed by magnolia and cacao. Though Tenochtitlan was destroyed, its fragrance seeped into the future, into the way homes and rituals still honour the senses. You may ask, why does this matter? Why dwell on courtyards, on fragrance, on such boring details? Because history is not only wars and empires. It is the scent of blossoms at dawn, the sweep of a broom on stone, the grinding of cacao in the quiet of a courtyard. These details, fragile as petals, shaped daily life as surely as battles did. To forget them is to forget how humans have always lived, through senses, through rituals, through small labours repeated endlessly. Think of the philosophy again, in Tenochtitlan, flower and song, truth expressed in fleeting things. The courtyards of Tenochtitlan were built on that truth. They embraced the transient, the delicate, the fragrant. Their destruction was not only political but sensory. The loss of fragrance was the loss of a world view, one where beauty, order and impermanence were entwined. And yet, perhaps this world view was not entirely lost. Each time a marigold blooms, each time chocolate is frothed, the fragrance of Tenochtitlan returns. It is faint, yes, but real. You may walk into a courtyard in modern Mexico City and smell blossoms carried on the breeze, and without knowing it, you are inhaling the memory of an empire. The scent is different now, mingled with traffic and dust, but it carries echoes of magnolia, cacao, and the philosophy of flowers. Pause then at this reflection. Consider how an empire was not only built with stone and steel, but with fragrance. How the most fragile of things, flowers and chocolate, became the markers of power, the tokens of spirituality, the essence of daily life. Consider too how their loss marked the fall of a world, and ask yourself, when history crumbles, what lingers longer, stone walls or fragrance in memory? In bustling markets of the Americas, cacao beans passed hand to hand not only for drink, but as tribute and currency in daily trade. When you picture money, perhaps you imagine coins, stamped with the faces of rulers, or paper notes, inked with symbols of the state. But in the Aztec world, money often came in the form of something softer, more fragrant, more perishable, the humble cacao bean. To hold wealth was to hold chocolate in its rawest form, not as drink, but as seeds, small and brown, rattling in baskets. These beans, fragile as they were, carried the weight of an empire's commerce. They paid for food, for cloth, for services. They were counted out carefully, one by one, in marketplaces that buzzed with trade. Step into the market of Tlatelolco, the great commercial hub beside Tenochtitlan, and you would hear the sound of beans exchanging hands. Vendors arranged baskets in rows. Buyers opened their woven purses and counted aloud. 10, 20, 50 beans. A turkey hen might cost 200 cacao beans, a tomato, perhaps 3, a rabbit, 30, a fresh avocado, 1 or 2. The beans were small, but their value was immense. To drop one on the ground was to lose a coin. To counterfeit one by carving clay or filling shells with wax was to risk punishment. Cacao was fragile, but it was trusted, and in trust lay the rhythm of Aztec markets. Why cacao? Because it was precious, difficult to grow, and yet divisible. Maize was abundant, too bulky for money. Cotton was valuable, but not easily carried in small amounts. Gold was known, yes, but in the Aztec economy it was ornamental, not the medium of daily exchange. Cacao beans, by contrast, could be carried in pouches, counted with ease, and used for purchases large or small. They also held sacred meaning. To use cacao as currency was not merely practical, it was symbolic, tying commerce to the divine gift of the gods. But cacao did not grow in the Valley of Mexico. It needed warmth, humidity, lowland soils. This made it both exotic and practical for money. Beans had to be imported, brought from regions like Chiapas, Oaxaca, and the Gulf Coast. Their journey was long, carried on the backs of porters, packed in baskets, brought through tribute or trade. Each bean in the marketplace of Tlatelolco was therefore a traveller, a migrant seed that had crossed mountains. Its value was tied not only to its rarity, but to the labour embedded in its arrival. In the marketplace, transactions were slow and careful. Imagine a woman buying tamales. She unties a cord at her waist, withdraws a small pouch, and counts out cacao beans into the vendor's hand. Each bean is inspected, turned over to check its authenticity. The vendor accepts them, pours them into his own pouch, and hands over the tamales wrapped in maize leaves. No coins clink, no paper rustles, only the dry rattle of beans. This was the music of Aztec commerce, yet cacao was more than market currency. It was tribute. Provinces under Aztec control were required to send cacao in bulk. Codex records list provinces obligated to deliver thousands of beans every few months, along with cloaks, maize, and obsidian blades. The beans flowed into Tenochtitlan, where they were stored, redistributed, consumed, or used in ritual. For nobles, cacao meant both wealth and prestige. To drink chocolate was to enjoy luxury. To hold cacao beans in storehouses was to display power. Tribute made the empire fragrant, filling courtyards with the smell of roasted beans, but also practical, filling markets with the currency of daily life. Handling cacao required diligence. Beans were delicate, prone to mould, to decay. They had to be dried, roasted, stored carefully. Wealth could literally rot if neglected. This gave Aztec money a strange fragility. A noble might hold thousands of cacao beans, but if his storehouse leaked or pests invaded, his fortune could vanish. Unlike gold or stone, cacao demanded constant care. In this way, Aztec money mirrored Aztec philosophy. Wealth was fleeting, like flowers, like life itself. To be rich was to hold something temporary, fragile, and fragrant. For commoners, cacao was both useful and distant. They used it in markets, but rarely drank chocolate, which was reserved for nobles, warriors, and merchants. To hand over cacao beans for daily goods was to interact with wealth they might never taste in its luxurious form. The bean was split between two worlds, currency for many, indulgence for few, and yet every transaction tied them together. A porter might never drink cacao, but his labour delivered it. A market woman might never sip frothy chocolate, but she used the beans to buy maize for her family. The bean was the link, the thread-weaving empire. Pause then, and imagine yourself in that market. The air is filled with voices, the cries of vendors selling chilies, maize cakes, salt, cotton thread. Dogs bark, children run. The smell of roasted maize mingles with the sharper scent of cacao. Faint but distinct as beans change hands. You hold a pouch at your side. Inside, 50 beans, the wealth of your day. You know their worth. You know you can buy a rabbit or perhaps a small cloak or several meals of tamales. You hold them carefully, for to lose them would be to lose food, comfort, survival. In this moment, money is not abstract. It is real, fragile, brown, rattling softly in your pouch. And yet, one question lingers. How could an empire rest its commerce on something so fragile, so perishable? What happened when the beans spoiled, or when tribute faltered, or when the flow of cacao was interrupted by war? The value of cacao beans did not rest only on their use in the marketplace. They were also bound to tribute, to politics, and to deception. Behind every bean lay a network of roads, caravans, tribute demands, and at times fraud. If the marketplace was the visible stage of cacao, tribute was the machinery that powered it, and counterfeiting was the shadow that haunted it. The empire's tribute system was vast, intricate, and carefully recorded. Codices list provinces by name, each with its obligations: baskets of maize, bolts of cloth, shields, obsidian blades, and always cacao beans. One province might owe 40 bags every 80 days. Another might owe 200. Tribute lists were dull to read, full of numbers and goods, yet behind each line were people labouring to meet quotas. Farmers in the hot, humid south tended cacao trees, harvesting pods, drying, seeds in the sun. Porters carried them in baskets woven from palm, straps cutting into their foreheads as they climbed mountain passes. Tribute officials tallied deliveries, checked quantities, and sealed baskets for transport to Tenochtitlan. What reached the capital was not just cacao, but proof of control. Tribute caravans moved constantly, roads filled with porters, their steps steady and repetitive, bearing the empire's lifeblood. Along with cacao came flowers, salt, honey, cloth, and even warriors to serve in campaigns. To the Aztecs, tribute was not just payment, it was submission. A province that sent cacao admitted defeat, acknowledged power, accepted subjugation. To sip chocolate in Tenochtitlan was, therefore, not merely indulgence. It was to drink victory, to taste the fruits of conquest. Each fragrant cup was underpinned by miles of labour and layers of submission. But with such reliance came fragility. Tribute was never guaranteed. Rebellions disrupted it. Droughts reduced harvests. A province might resist, withholding its beans, forcing the empire to send armies to enforce tribute. In such moments, courtyards in Tenochtitlan felt the absence. Storehouses emptied, markets grew tense, the aroma of chocolate thinned. For an empire so tied to perishable wealth, interruptions in flow were deeply felt. Nobles who had built their rituals on chocolate found themselves without it. What could it mean when the fragrance of cacao no longer filled the courtyards? Even when tribute arrived, another problem lingered: fraud. Cacao beans, so small and so valued, invited deception. Chroniclers note that counterfeit beans circulated, shells filled with mud, beans carved from wood, even wax-filled imitations painted to look real. A vendor could slip such counterfeits into a transaction, passing them off as true. Imagine the irritation of a buyer who, upon returning home, found that his pouch rattled with clay instead of cacao. Fraud eroded trust, but it also showed how deeply the empire depended on these fragile tokens. If cacao was not money, why bother to counterfeit it? Its very counterfeiting proved its importance. Markets responded with vigilance. Vendors inspected beans carefully, rolling them between fingers, biting them to test their authenticity. Transactions slowed as each bean was checked. In some cases, disputes arose, one vendor accusing another of fraud, tempers flaring over what might seem to you a handful of worthless seeds. But to the Aztecs, this was no small matter. A single cacao bean was food, labour, survival. Fraud was theft of life itself. Tribute officials, too, kept careful watch. When baskets of beans arrived in Tenochtitlan, they were counted, checked, recorded. Scribes painted neat glyphs and codices, each symbol for cacao carefully drawn. They noted not only quantity but quality. Spoiled beans were rejected. Mouldy beans reduced value. Tribute lists, dry as they appear today, were therefore more than bureaucracy. They were the guardrails of an economy built on perishable currency. Consider how strange this seems compared to coins of bronze or silver. Aztec wealth could rot. A storehouse of cacao could vanish if moisture seeped in. A rat infestation could eat through fortunes. Wealth demanded maintenance. Guards stood watch over storehouses not of gold but of beans, checking dryness, inspecting for pests. Wealth was never fixed, never eternal. It was fragile, as fleeting as the blossoms in a courtyard. And yet, it worked. For centuries, cacao bound the Aztec economy, fragile though it was. The political meaning of cacao was clear. Nobles demanded it. Markets ran on it. Warriors were rewarded with it. Merchants, especially the Pochteca, dealt in it, growing rich by controlling trade routes from southern cacao lands. To command cacao was to command wealth. To lose it was to lose status. Moctezuma himself was said to drink dozens of cups of cacao each day, frothy, spiced, served in golden goblets. Such consumption was not hunger, it was performance. Each cup declared his supremacy, his command over provinces that supplied the beans. In daily life, the beans trickled downward. A commoner might use them to buy maize, to purchase tamales in the market, to barter for salt or chili peppers. Each bean was precious. To drop one was to stoop quickly, to scramble in dust, to retrieve what might feed a child. The beans that seemed trivial to nobles were survival to commoners. Thus, in the same city, cacao was both opulence and necessity, symbol and sustenance. Picture again the marketplace. A boy runs errands for his family, clutching a pouch with 30 beans. He buys fish, handing over 5. He buys chilies, handing over 3 more. At day's end, only a few remain, and these he returns to his mother. The pouch feels lighter, his steps slower, yet the family has food. Money has done its work, fragile though it was. Now picture a noble, elsewhere in the city, sipping frothy chocolate while servants fan the air and musicians play softly. For him, the beans are not mere survival, but abundance, tribute, glory. The same bean, 2 meanings, 2 worlds. But consider the risk again. What happened when supply faltered? What if tribute stopped? If caravans were attacked? If drought killed harvests? Could an economy survive when its very currency was at the mercy of weather and war? The story of cacao beans as currency cannot end in the marketplace of Tlatelolco alone. To see their full journey, you must follow them into conquest, into colonial rule, and into their transformation from fragile money into sweetened drink, from tribute to commodity. It is a story of continuity and change, where the fragrance of cacao survived even as the system that gave it value dissolved. When the Spanish arrived, they encountered an economy unlike any in Europe. They were accustomed to silver coins, gold ornaments, and fixed currencies minted by kings. To discover that a seed, fragile and perishable, could function as money puzzled them. At first they hesitated to trust it, but soon necessity taught them otherwise. Living in Tenochtitlan, relying on markets for food, they too began to use cacao beans as currency. Chroniclers noted Spaniards buying eggs, poultry, or maize with cacao. The empire's seeds had become the invaders' coins, yet the Spanish also saw the fragility of this money. Beans spoiled, mould spread, pests destroyed stores. They began to import and demand other forms of wealth: silver, gold, land, and labour. The great silver mines of Zacatecas and Potosi soon overshadowed cacao as sources of currency. In time, the bean lost its role as official money, replaced by hard metals that could not rot. The fragile seed, once counted one by one in the bustling marketplace, became less central to trade. But it did not disappear. Instead, it transformed. Cacao shifted from money to drink, from currency to commodity. Spaniards learned to prepare it, though they altered it. They sweetened it with sugar, added cinnamon and milk, and made it palatable to European tastes. Chocolate spread across the Atlantic, becoming a fashionable drink in Spain, then in France, then in courts across Europe. What had been tribute currency in Tenochtitlan became luxury in Madrid and Paris. The bean's value endured, but its meaning shifted. No longer the clinking coins of a market pouch, it became the froth in a porcelain cup. In Mesoamerica, however, cacao lingered as small currency long into colonial times. Documents record indigenous people still using beans for daily purchases in rural markets, even in the 17th century. A chicken might still cost a few dozen beans, a tomato a handful. Money in the form of seeds refused to vanish overnight. But gradually coins spread, enforced by colonial rule, and the bean's role diminished. Yet in memory and practice, cacao retained dignity. It remained sacred in ritual drinks, offered in weddings, births, and funerals. Its fragrance still carried echoes of empire. Think of the fragility again. Wealth that could mould, money that could be eaten by rodents, fortunes that might vanish with a spoiled harvest. To you, it may seem unstable. Yet to the Aztecs it was fitting. Life itself was fragile. Flowers withered. Human life ended in an instant. To root wealth in such impermanence was not absurd but profound. To count beans was to count time, to acknowledge the fleeting nature of power. Gold lasted, but it did not nourish. Cacao vanished, but it sustained. In this paradox lay its meaning. The Spanish never fully understood this philosophy. They valued permanence, accumulation, metals that endured centuries. They saw cacao as inferior money, useful only in the absence of coins. But to the Aztecs, permanence was not the highest value. The flower, the song, the bean, all were precious because they passed. In their economy, even money reminded people that nothing lasted, that wealth was temporary. The order itself required constant tending. Over time, cacao became global. Plantations were established in the Caribbean, in Venezuela, later in Africa. The bean spread far beyond its Mesoamerican cradle, becoming a commodity for world markets. Slavery and forced labour replaced tribute caravans, but the rhythm of exploitation continued. The bean no longer rattled in pouches as money, it rattled in ships' holds as cargo. Its fragrance reached Europe, where chocolate became an aristocratic indulgence, then a middle-class staple, and finally, with industrialization, a sweet accessible to millions. The bean lost its role as coin, but gained a new one as comfort. Yet something was lost in the process. In Tenochtitlan, cacao had tied money to ritual, economy to spirituality, wealth to fragrance. In Europe, it became taste, pleasure, indulgence. The philosophy of impermanence was stripped away. Money became metal, chocolate became luxury, and the fragile wisdom of seeds was forgotten. What remained were echoes, the word cacao, the association with richness, the faint memory that this drink was once currency. Pause and imagine once more the Aztec market, A woman counts out beans for chilies. A man buys a rabbit. Children watch as pouches rattle with small dry seeds. This was not fiction, it was daily life, sustained for generations. Now imagine the same bean, centuries later, melted with sugar, poured into cups in Madrid, sipped in Paris salons, sold in modern supermarkets. The bean has travelled far, its meaning transformed, but it still carries traces of its old life. In every chocolate bar lies the ghost of money, and so, the story of cacao beans as currency is not only economic but philosophical. It asks, what is wealth? Is it permanence, or is it fragility? Is it gold that endures, or beans that nourish? The Aztecs built an empire on seeds, and though that empire fell, the seeds survived, transformed, globalized. Even now, when you taste chocolate, you're tasting history. You are touching money in its oldest, most fragrant form. Perhaps the better question is not why the Aztecs used cacao as currency, but why we stopped. Was permanence truly progress, or was something lost when we abandoned fragile wealth for hard metal? In the soft light of dawn, young boys rose in silence, bound for the Carmacac and Tenochtitlan, schools where duty shaped every breath. When you think of Aztec civilization, perhaps your mind turns first to temples or warriors. Yet one of the most overlooked aspects of their society was education. Unlike many civilizations of the ancient world, the Aztecs demanded schooling for all children, regardless of rank. Boys and girls alike were sent to institutions where they learned discipline, survival, duty, and the cultural values of their people. These schools, Carmacac for the children of nobles, Tenochtitlan for commoners, were not places of excitement or leisure. They were places of rules, of routines, of endless, small tasks. They were, in their own way, boring. But in that boredom lay the foundation of empire. The Carmacac, the house of lineage, was reserved for the sons and daughters of nobility. Here, young people learned not only reading, writing, and ritual, but also how to govern, how to carry themselves with dignity, how to speak in metaphors, and how to honour the gods. It was a place of strict discipline. Students rose before dawn, bathed in cold water, and swept temple courtyards. They memorized prayers, practiced orations, and learned to fast. Punishments were harsh, pricking with maguey thorns, long hours of labour, sleepless nights. Nobility was not indulgence, but responsibility, and the Carmacac was designed to produce leaders who could bear its weight. The Tenochtitlan, the house of youth, was different but no less demanding. Here, the children of commoners were trained primarily in military duty. Boys learned to march, to carry loads, to wield weapons. They swept the courtyards, fetched firewood, and laboured in the fields. They were drilled not in poetry, but in endurance. Their task was not to lead, but to serve, to fight, to carry. Girls, too, received education, though often in the home, weaving, cooking, and child-rearing, the endless work that sustained households in the empire. The division was clear, but the principle was the same. No one was exempt from discipline. Step into one of these schools in imagination. The air is cool at dawn. Children rise from reed mats, their eyes heavy, their bodies aching from yesterday's tasks. A master shouts commands. Some sweep the courtyard with reed brooms, removing dust and leaves. Others carry buckets of water from nearby canals. Still others kneel in prayer, repeating memorized words, their voices murmuring in unison. The sound is not joyful. It is steady, rhythmic, boring even. But boredom was the point. Life itself was discipline, and to endure monotony was to prove readiness for duty. In the Carmacac, instruction stretched beyond daily chores. Students copied glyphs, learning to read the codices that recorded tribute, rituals, and histories. They learned astronomy, calculating calendars that guided agriculture and festivals. They practiced oratory, speaking in metaphor, weaving flowers and songs into speech. A noble must persuade, must lead, must sound like wisdom itself. This was not entertainment but labour. Hours were spent memorizing, repeating, enduring correction. For the Aztecs, education was less about curiosity than about continuity, ensuring that every noble knew how to uphold tradition without deviation. In the Tenochtitlan, the tasks were simpler but no less demanding. Boys carried loads on their backs, straps cutting across their foreheads, training their muscles for future campaigns. They learned to build roads, to dig ditches, to march in step. Weapons training came later, but first came endurance. To serve the empire was to carry its weight, literally. At night, they slept on reed mats, ate simple maize porridge, and rose again before dawn. Teachers corrected laziness with harsh punishments, sometimes holding children over smoke fires to sting their eyes, sometimes piercing their skin with thorns. Pain was a lesson. Duty required suffering. And yet these schools were not prisons. They were accepted as necessary. Parents willingly sent their children, knowing that education was the path to honour, to survival. A noble who neglected his son's training risked shame. A commoner who kept his boy from the Tenochtitlan was seen as selfish, denying the empire a servant. Education was not a choice, it was obligation. And in this obligation, society was bound together. Think of the rhythm of these schools, sweeping, hauling, memorizing, fasting. Day after day, the same tasks repeated. It was tedious, perhaps even oppressive. But it instilled a sense of order that permeated Aztec life. Just as the empire demanded tribute, so did it demand discipline from its children. The schools were microcosms of the empire itself, structures of routine, built on labour, designed to endure. Pause and imagine again. A child bent over a codex, tracing glyphs by lamplight, his eyes heavy, his fingers cramped. Another child hauling a bundle of firewood across the courtyard, sweat dripping, breath heavy. Others kneeling in prayer, whispering words they scarcely understand. The room smells of sweat, smoke, damp reed mats. Nothing glamorous, nothing grand, only the monotony of discipline. Yet from this monotony would rise leaders, warriors, priests, mothers, weavers, farmers. From boredom came survival. But one question lingers. If education was built on such harsh discipline, how did it shape the character of an empire? Did it produce obedience at the cost of creativity, or did it instill resilience that allowed the Aztecs to flourish? To step inside the world of Aztec schooling was to enter a life of rhythm and restraint. It was not the pursuit of curiosity in the way you might imagine schools today. It was a training ground, a forge where children were shaped by monotony, punishment, and ritual into the adults their society required. In the Karmakak and Tenochtitlan, every hour of the day carried meaning, not because it was exciting, but because it was controlled. At dawn, the first task was purification. Children rose from reed mats and washed in cold water. In the Karmakak, this was more than hygiene, it was ritual. Cold baths toughened the body, stilled the mind, and reminded students that life itself was discipline. After bathing came sweeping. The courtyards had to be spotless. Dust and fallen leaves were enemies of order, and sweeping was a lesson in vigilance. To sweep was to practice humility, to learn that even nobles must bow to duty. In the Tenochtitlan, the same act prepared boys for labour. A future soldier must endure tedium as well as hardship. What better way to learn than by hours of sweeping stones? Meals were plain and sparse. Maize gruel, beans, perhaps a bit of chili. Nobles and commoners alike ate simply in school, for indulgence was frowned upon. Hunger was part of discipline. In the Karmakak, fasting was common, teaching students to master their bodies. They were expected to go without food for days, surviving on water and prayers. To fast was to prepare for priesthood, to prove worthiness to serve the gods. In the Tenochtitlan, fasting was rarer, but hunger still shaped life. Food was earned through labour, through carrying wood, through enduring drills. Both schools taught the same lesson: comfort weakened, hardship strengthened. Punishments were harsh and memorable. In both institutions, laziness was despised. A boy who disobeyed might be pricked with maguey thorns, sharp and stinging. Others were forced to inhale smoke until their eyes watered, or to carry heavy loads far beyond their strength. In the Karmakak, where future priests and nobles were trained, punishments could be even more severe. A child might be forced to keep vigil all night, standing without rest, chanting prayers until dawn. Another might be made to lie on cold stones, sleepless, as a reminder of duty. These punishments were not seen as cruelty, but as correction. To be spared discipline was to be abandoned to weakness. The routines of study varied. In the Karmakak, students spent long hours memorizing hymns, prayers, and ritual formulas. They learned astronomy, tracking the movement of stars to align ceremonies with the calendar. They studied history, not as stories of curiosity, but as lists of rulers, battles and lineages to be preserved without error. They learned oratory, speaking in metaphors woven from flowers and songs. Every word had to sound elevated, refined, worthy of a noble. Girls in the Kalmakak learned to weave, to embroider, to maintain ritual purity, and to take part in ceremonies. Their discipline was no less strict, their lives no less controlled. In the Tenochtitlan, the curriculum was simpler but relentless. Boys learned obedience, endurance and martial skill. They carried wood, dug ditches and marched in formation. They were trained to accompany warriors into battle, first as porters carrying supplies, later as fighters themselves. The Tenochtitlan was a school of duty rather than knowledge, yet it instilled pride. To serve the empire, to fight and perhaps capture enemies for sacrifice was honour. The boredom of endless drills was the foundation of glory. Ceremonies punctuated these routines. In the Kalmakak, students participated in temple rituals, sweeping altars, carrying offerings, chanting prayers. They practiced the careful preparation of incense, learning to grind resins, to arrange flowers, to handle sacred objects with reverence. Ritual was not occasional, it was daily. In the Tenochtitlan, ceremonies were simpler but no less binding. Students trained together, ate together, worked together, and took part in public festivals where their discipline was displayed. Dance too was training, steps repeated until they became muscle memory, teaching rhythm, endurance and unity. The contrast between the two schools was sharp but complementary. The Kalmakak produced priests, leaders and scribes, those who guided thought and ritual. The Tenochtitlan produced soldiers and labourers, those who carried the empire's burdens. Together they ensured continuity. Nobles could not rule without followers. Commoners could not serve without leaders. Education created the balance, harsh though it was. Daily life in these schools was not glorious. It was repetition, sweep, carry, chant, fast. Day after day the same tasks, yet within that monotony lay survival. Empires are not built only on battles, but on discipline repeated across generations. The Aztecs knew this. They did not trust chance. They built schools to ensure that every child, noble or commoner, was shaped by duty. If a student grew weary, there was no escape. Duty was life itself. Imagine again the scene. In one courtyard, noble children chant prayers in unison, their voices rising with smoke from incense. In another, commoner boys march with bundles of firewood, sweat beading on their foreheads. Teachers watch, stern and unyielding, ready to punish failure. The sun rises higher, the tasks repeat, the day stretches long. Nothing glamorous, nothing thrilling, only the steady beat of discipline, and yet in that steady beat the empire endured. But here another question emerges. In shaping children so strictly, did the Aztec schools prepare them for resilience, or did they limit their freedom, binding them too tightly to tradition? The story of Aztec education does not end in the courtyards of the Kalmakak or the training grounds of the Tenochtitlan. To see its full significance, you must step back and consider how these schools shaped the empire itself. Every sweep of a broom, every memorized hymn, every bundle of firewood carried was part of a larger project. To build a society where duty was not optional, but inevitable. Education was not a privilege, it was a command. And from this command flowed both the strength and the rigidity of the Aztec world. The first and most striking effect was unity. By sending all children to school, the Aztecs eliminated the possibility of idleness. A noble's son could not lounge in wealth. He was sent to the Kalmakak to endure fasts, sleepless vigils, and endless memorization. A commoner's son could not avoid labour. He was sent to the Tenochtitlan to march, haul, and sweat. Girls too were trained in weaving, cooking, and household duties, ensuring that no hand in society was left idle. This universal discipline bound the empire together. Everyone was trained in their role. Everyone carried the weight of duty. It was a system that left little room for dissent. The second effect was endurance. The Aztec Empire was built on labour, tribute caravans, military campaigns, constant building and rebuilding. Without endurance, it could not have survived. Schools trained endurance from childhood. A boy who fasted for days in the Karmakak learned to withstand hunger on campaign. A boy who carried wood in the Tenochtitlan grew strong enough to carry supplies for warriors. A girl who spent long hours weaving in the home prepared for the endless work of supporting a household. Each repetition of daily tasks hardened children for the burdens of adult life. Boredom became training, monotony became survival. But the third effect was control. Education ensured that children did not question their place. Nobles were trained to lead, commoners to serve. The hierarchy was reinforced daily, woven into the tasks of sweeping, chanting, hauling. A noble's child learned metaphor, astronomy and law, preparing for command. A commoner's child learned obedience, strength, and silence, preparing for service. There was little opportunity for crossover. Social mobility was rare, and the schools ensured it stayed so. Education was not only preparation, it was containment. It kept society in its place. Yet within this rigidity lay resilience. When Spaniards arrived, they were astonished at the order of Aztec life. Markets were efficient, armies disciplined, rituals exact. These were not the products of chance, but of education. The Karmakak and Tenochtitlan had trained generations to obey, to endure, to serve the collective before the self. The empire's power, its ability to organize tribute, armies and rituals, depended on this schooling. Without it, the machinery of the empire might have faltered. Still, the question remains, what was lost? Did this strict education stifle curiosity, creativity, individuality? Perhaps. The Aztec system valued continuity over innovation. Students were not encouraged to question but to memorize, not to explore but to endure. Poetry and song flourished, but even these were bound by tradition, by metaphor, by forms handed down. Practical invention gave way to ritual repetition. In creating such disciplined citizens, did the Aztecs sacrifice the possibility of change? Did the rigidity that strengthened the empire also make it brittle in the face of conquest? Consider the legacy. After the Spanish conquest, the Karmakak and Tenochtitlan disappeared as institutions replaced by colonial schools, churches and missions. Yet their imprint endured. Indigenous communities continued to value discipline, respect for elders, and endurance in work. The habits of rising early, of sweeping courtyards, of fasting, of memorizing prayers did not vanish. They shifted, adapted, carried forward into new forms. Even today, in rural parts of Mexico, the rhythm of discipline, the expectation that children contribute to household labor, echoes the structure of Aztec education. You might look at modern schooling and see traces too. The idea that children should rise early, follow routines, memorize lessons, endure boredom, these are not unique to the modern age. They echo ancient practices. The Aztec schools remind us that education has long been about more than knowledge. It is about shaping citizens, instilling values, preparing bodies and minds for roles in society. Whether in the Karmakak, the Tenochtitlan, or a modern classroom, the struggle between curiosity and discipline continues. Imagine, finally, the daily scene one last time. A courtyard swept clean, children kneeling in prayer, their voices low, others hauling firewood, their backs bent, teachers watching, stern, silent. The sun rises higher, the tasks repeat. It is monotonous, it is tedious, it is boring. And yet, in that monotony lies the secret of empire, the ability to endure, to obey, to repeat without faltering. The Aztecs understood that greatness was built not only on temples and warriors, but on children shaped by discipline. And so, as you leave the schools behind, you carry a question with you. Is education meant to free the mind, or to bind it? Is its purpose curiosity or continuity? The Aztecs chose continuity, and in doing so, they built an empire. But perhaps they also revealed a universal truth, that the balance between curiosity and duty is what shapes every society in every age. Before sunrise, women knelt by the hearth, stone against stone, grinding maize in steady silence, each motion a quiet rhythm passed down through generations. If temples and battles shaped the glory of the Aztec Empire, it was corn that shaped its survival. Maize was the food of life, the substance of flesh itself according to creation myths. The gods had made human beings from ground maize dough, and so every meal repeated the act of creation. Yet behind this sacred symbolism was endless, grinding labour. To feed the empire, women bent each morning over stone slabs, their hands pressing, pulling, crushing kernels into meal. The sound of grinding was the pulse of daily life, steady, repetitive, monotonous, yet indispensable. Without it, no ritual could be performed, no warrior fed, no family sustained. In the rhythm of grinding lay the true heartbeat of the Aztec world. The work began before dawn. Women rose from reed mats, the house still dark, the air cool. In the corner sat the metate, a flat stone set on 3 legs, worn smooth by years of use. Beside it lay the mano, a cylindrical grinding stone, heavy, shaped to fit the hands. Kernels of dried maize stored in baskets were fetched and soaked. Before grinding, the maize had to be softened through nixtamalization. Boiled with lime, then rinsed, the hull loosened, the grain prepared for crushing. This chemical process, discovered long before the Aztecs, released nutrients, making maize more digestible and life-sustaining. Without it, diets would have led to malnutrition. With it, maize became the foundation of survival. Once prepared, the kernels were poured onto the metate. The woman knelt, grasped the mano, and pressed it forward and back, forward and back. The sound was steady, a low scraping punctuated by the soft crunch of breaking grains. Her body rocked with the motion, shoulders straining, arms burning, back bent. The work was not glamorous. It was slow, repetitive, tiring. But it was necessary, and it was daily. Every tortilla, every tamale, every gruel began this way, through the silent labour of grinding. This was not occasional work. A household of 4 or 5 needed hours of grinding each day to supply enough flour. Women began before dawn and continued through morning, shaping dough into tortillas, patting them flat between hands, cooking them on the comal, a clay griddle set over the hearth. The smell of toasting maize filled the room, smoky, warm, comforting. Children stirred from mats, husbands prepared for labour or war, but the woman remained at the hearth, her work unending. Once tortillas were made, tamales were next, wrapped in maize husks, steamed slowly. The day's meals were shaped one by one in the dim light of the hearth. The hearth itself was sacred. In Aztec thought, fire was divine, a gift of the gods, tended with care. Women, as keepers of the hearth, were guardians of that gift. Their labour was not only practical but spiritual. Each act of grinding, each tortilla placed on the comal, was a renewal of creation. To grind maize was to echo the gods grinding bones to create humanity. Boring, yes, but cosmic. The repetition of the hearth sustained not only bodies but beliefs. Yet we must not romanticize too quickly. This labour was exhausting. The posture of grinding wore down knees and backs. Hands grew calloused, shoulders ached. A lifetime of grinding left bodies bent, joints swollen. The monotony was relentless. Unlike warriors, who fought battles intermittently, or nobles, who enjoyed courtyards and chocolate, women at the hearth worked daily without pause. Their labour rarely won glory, but it fed the empire more surely than any conquest. The sound of grinding was so constant that it became part of the city's texture. Imagine walking through a neighbourhood at dawn. From every house you hear it, the scrape of stone on stone, the rhythm of women bent at metuts. Dozens, hundreds, thousands of households repeating the same act. The city's markets would fill later with goods, temples with chants, plazas with speeches. But before all of that, there was grinding. It was the unseen chorus of survival. Consider also the social weight of this labour. Women were judged by their diligence at the hearth. A wife who rose early, who ground maize well, who kept tortillas warm and plentiful was praised. One who neglected the work was shamed. Marriage negotiations even referenced skill at grinding, for it was the measure of a household's future. A noble's daughter might be spared some of the work, attended by servants, but she still learned the motions, for it was considered essential knowledge. No woman was exempt from maize, for maize was life. The hearth was also a place of teaching. Daughters watched mothers grind, learning the rhythm of stone, the patience required. Small hands began by shelling kernels, then by patting tortillas, then finally by taking the mano and pushing it across the metate. The lesson was slow, repetitive, absorbed over years. To teach a girl to grind was to teach her to sustain life. The hearth was her school, the metate her textbook, the dough her lesson. In contrast to the Karmakak and Telpochkali, where boys were shaped by discipline, girls were shaped by repetition at the hearth. Different spaces, same principle, duty before self. Pause now and imagine the scene. A woman kneels before her metate. The fire crackles nearby, warming the komel. The air smells of maize and smoke. She presses the mano forward, pulls it back again and again. Her body rocks with the motion, her mind perhaps drifting, yet her hands never falter. A child stirs nearby, a husband ties his sandals, the city outside begins to wake. The grinding continues, steady, essential, boring, eternal. In this rhythm lies survival, and yet one question lingers. How could a society so dependent on this silent, endless labour value it so little in public life? Warriors were celebrated, nobles adorned, priests exalted, but what of the women who ground the maize, without whom none of the others could endure? The sound of maize being ground on stone was more than a household rhythm. It was the pulse of community life. In every neighbourhood of Tenochtitlan and beyond, the scrape of mano on metat echoed at dawn, at midday, at dusk. Each household repeated the same task, yet together they formed a collective chorus, a soundscape that defined society. In the monotony of grinding, women were not isolated but bound to each other through shared labour, through the knowledge that in countless homes others knelt over stones just as they did. The labour was heavy. Ethnographic studies of traditional grinding show that women often spent 3 to 5 hours daily at the metate. The posture was punishing. Knees pressed into mats, backs hunched, shoulders strained. Over years, the toll was visible. Older women walked with bent spines, their joints swollen, their hands roughened from years of stonework. Some bore grooves on their forearms from the repetitive pressure of the mano. Grinding shaped bodies as much as it shaped maize, leaving physical traces that marked a life of labour. These marks were not celebrated, but they were common, the quiet evidence of women's contribution to survival. The hearth was also the centre of teaching. Daughters learned by watching, imitating, repeating. Childhood games often involved miniature metates, small grinding stones given to girls so they could practice alongside their mothers. By adolescence, most girls could grind maize efficiently, their bodies already trained in the rhythm. Marriage negotiations often included references to skill at grinding, for it signalled a woman's readiness to maintain a household. To lack this skill was shameful, for it threatened survival. A husband might endure many difficulties but not hunger, and hunger was avoided only through the daily labour of the hearth. Yet this labour was not only practical, it was bound to ritual. In Aztec cosmology, maize was sacred, a gift of the gods who had journeyed into the underworld to find the seed. To grind maize was to participate in that myth. Each act of crushing kernels between stones echoed the gods grinding bones to form humanity. Women, in their kitchens, repeated the divine act of creation daily. This belief gave spiritual weight to monotony. The metate was more than a tool. It was a sacred instrument, linking the household to the cosmos. The hearth fire, kept alive day after day, was a fragment of divine flame, and maize dough, patted into tortillas, was the flesh of humanity itself. Community rituals often centered on maize. Festivals in honor of Tenochtitlan, the maize deity, involved offerings of tamales and tortillas, prepared by women at their hearths. During such times, grinding took on festive significance. Women gathered, shared labor, sang as they ground, turning monotony into ritual. Grinding was not always solitary. In preparation for feasts or ceremonies, groups of women worked together, their stones aligned, their motions synchronized, their voices blending in song. These gatherings transformed the tedious into the communal, the ordinary into the sacred. The scrape of stones became music, accompaniment to prayers and celebrations. Still, the daily grind was often silent. Not every household sang. Not every day was festival. For most women, the work was solitary, performed in the dimness of early morning, while others still slept. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the steady rasp of stone. It was in this silence that women carried thoughts unspoken. Perhaps they remembered their mothers who had taught them. Perhaps they wondered about their daughters who would one day kneel as they did. Perhaps they simply let their minds wander, drifting with the rhythm. The silence of grinding was not empty. It was filled with memory, thought, endurance. The monotony also shaped time. In a world without clocks, grinding marked the hours. The sound at dawn signalled the start of day, the preparation of morning tortillas. Grinding at midday meant tamales steaming for lunch. Grinding at dusk prepared evening meals. The rhythm was constant, the same tasks repeated, yet through them, families measured the flow of life. Just as bells would later ring in colonial churches, the scrape of stone was the timekeeper of Aztec households. And yet, despite its importance, this labour was undervalued. Warriors were celebrated for victories, priests for rituals, nobles for leadership. Women's grinding rarely entered public memory. Codices depicted battles, rulers, temples, but rarely hearths. The quiet, endless work that sustained society was left unrecorded, as if too ordinary to matter. Yet, without it, there would have been no warriors to fight, no nobles to lead, no priests to sacrifice. The invisibility of women's labour is perhaps its most striking feature. It was everywhere, essential, yet unacknowledged. There is a paradox here. The Aztecs believed maize was sacred, that humanity was made from it, that grinding was a cosmic act. Yet the women who ground maize daily received little recognition. The act was divine. The labourers remained invisible. Perhaps this is the nature of survival itself. The most important work is often the most taken for granted. Boring, monotonous, overlooked, yet indispensable. Picture again the household. A woman kneels at the metate. Her arms move rhythmically, pushing and pulling the mano. Sweat beads on her forehead, though the air is cool. A child watches, learning silently. The fire crackles, the comel warms. Outside, the city stirs. In another house, another woman grinds. In another and another. The city breathes through them, its life sustained by their monotony. Without their work, hunger would spread. The markets would falter. The temples would stand empty. In their silence lay the true foundation of empire. And yet consider the weight of this silence. Did women feel pride in their labour or only weariness? Did they embrace the sacredness of maize or resent the endless repetition? Were they honoured in private memory if not in public record? These questions linger, unanswered, for their voices are lost to us. We know the sound of their stones, but not the words of their thoughts. The conquest of Tenochtitlan brought fire and ruin, yet the sound of grinding did not cease. While temples were toppled and markets disrupted, while noble schools collapsed and tribute lists changed, the hearth remained. Women still rose before dawn, still knelt before their metes, still pressed the mano forward and back. Armies might crumble, rulers fall, but families still needed tortillas, and tortillas still required grinding. In this sense, the labour of women outlasted empire. It was too essential to be destroyed. Conquest might silence drums in temples, but it could not silence the rasp of stone on stone at dawn. The Spanish too came to depend on this labour. They brought wheat and ovens, yes, but maize remained the staple of life in Mesoamerica. Colonial kitchens absorbed maize as much as they absorbed European foods. Indigenous women continued to grind, to pat tortillas, to steam tamales. In haciendas and households, their work sustained Spaniards as it had sustained Aztecs. The sacred meaning shifted, the rituals altered, but the labour itself endured. The metita remained in kitchens for centuries, unchanged, its surface polished by generations of hands. Over time, grinding acquired new layers of meaning. It became a symbol of indigenous persistence. While temples were rebuilt as churches and now our rituals suppressed, the daily act of grinding continued, quietly defiant. The same motion that had fed Aztec households now fed colonial ones. The same rhythm that had marked time in Tenochtitlan now marked time in colonial towns. Grinding carried memory, even if unspoken. It was continuity beneath conquest, survival through monotony. But the toll on women remained. Colonial observers noted the hours spent kneeling at metates, the bent backs, the swollen joints. Even in new contexts, the labour was invisible, taken for granted, described only in passing. Travelers wrote of markets filled with tortillas and tamales, marveling at abundance, but rarely paused to consider the hands that made them. The invisibility of women's work persisted just as it had in Aztec codices, essential but unacknowledged, and yet the sacred lingered. In villages, maize remained bound to ritual. Offerings of tamales were made at festivals. Corn husks were woven into decorations. Grinding for special occasions became communal again, women gathering to prepare food in groups singing as they worked. In these moments, the monotonous turned celebratory, echoing the rituals of earlier centuries. The matate, though ordinary, retained its link to the divine. Each tortilla was still, in a sense, creation renewed. The legacy of this labour extends into modern kitchens. Even today, in rural Mexico and Central America, the sound of grinding can still be heard. Women kneel at metates, pressing kernels softened by lime, shaping tortillas with practiced hands. In cities, machines and mills have replaced much of the labour, but in villages the rhythm persists. Tortillas made by hand are still prized for their texture, their flavour, their connection to tradition. To eat one is to taste not only maize but history, the countless hours of grinding that sustained generations. In modern festivals, the symbolism endures. Marigolds may mark altars at Dia de los Muertos. Chocolate may be sweetened with sugar, but maize still forms the foundation of offerings. Tamales wrapped in husks, tortillas stacked neatly, atole served warm. These foods, born of grinding, remain central to memory and ritual. The metate, though sometimes replaced, still sits in many homes, a quiet relic, its surface worn smooth by centuries of hands. It is not displayed as treasure, but it is treasured all the same, for it ties families to ancestors, kitchens to hearths long gone. Pause and reflect on this continuity. The Aztec Empire fell, but its warriors are forgotten more quickly than its women at the hearth. The names of nobles fade, but tortillas remain daily food. The monotony of grinding, so invisible, has proven more enduring than the grandeur of palaces. Perhaps this is the lesson. History is not only battles and rulers, but the repetitive, boring tasks that sustain life. To grind maize was tedious, but it was also eternal. It shaped bodies, communities, rituals, and nations. Now picture once more the scene across time. In Tenochtitlan, a woman grinds at dawn, her fire crackling in the dimness. In a colonial hacienda, another woman grinds, feeding both indigenous and Spanish households. In a modern village, a grandmother grinds, teaching her granddaughter the rhythm. The sound is the same, the motion unchanged. Forward, back, forward, back. A small sound, easily ignored but louder in meaning than drums of war. It is the sound of survival. And so we return to the question left earlier. Why was this labour so undervalued when it was so essential? Perhaps because it was ordinary, because it was constant, because it was performed by women. But history, if listened to carefully, reveals its truth. The empire may have celebrated warriors, priests and nobles, but it endured through women who ground maize, silently shaping the life of a people. And perhaps the final reflection is this. In every tortilla eaten today, there is an echo of their labour. In every tamale unwrapped, a memory of their silence. The rasp of stone on stone has faded in many places, replaced by machines, but its rhythm remains in culture, in ritual, in taste. History lingers not only in ruins but in kitchens. The Aztec Empire is gone, yet its women at the hearth still feed the world. Laid out in quiet workshops, turquoise, obsidian and feathers shimmered under soft light, each chosen not for beauty alone, but for sacred meaning and rank. Every society has its markers of wealth and prestige. In some, it is gold and silver, in others silk or ivory. In the Aztec world, three materials stood above all others: turquoise, obsidian, and feathers. None of these sustained life in the way maize or water did. They did not fill bellies, build houses, or fuel fires. Yet they mattered because they symbolized status, spirituality, and the reach of empire. To see an Aztec noble adorned in turquoise, carrying obsidian crowned with feathers, was to see authority itself woven into colour and stone. These materials carried meanings that reached far beyond their physical forms, turning the ordinary into signs of extraordinary power. Turquoise was rare, treasured, and foreign. The Valley of Mexico did not produce it. Instead, it came from the distant north. perhaps from what is now New Mexico or even beyond, carried through trade networks that spanned deserts and mountains. Small stones were shaped into mosaics, inlaid into masks, knives and shields. Nobles prized turquoise for its shimmering blue-green hues, colours that mirrored water and sky, symbols of fertility and divinity. To wear turquoise was to align oneself with the sacred forces that sustained the world. It was fragile, easily chipped, but its rarity gave it weight. Tribute lists record its arrival as gifts, tokens of submission, proof of wide-reaching connections. In a world without metal coinage, turquoise functioned as treasure, its value measured less in utility than in prestige. Obsidian was more common but no less vital. A volcanic glass, it was found in abundance across central Mexico. Black, sharp and glimmering, it was the substance of knives, blades and tools. Obsidian weapons could cut flesh with a precision unmatched by bronze or iron. Yet obsidian was not only for war, it was polished into mirrors, used for ritual gazing, for divination. Priests peered into obsidian mirrors as if into the eyes of gods, seeking visions of the unseen. To hold obsidian was to hold both violence and vision, the power to cut and the power to see. Its abundance made it common in one sense, but its symbolic use made it precious in another. Even the dullest household tool carried echoes of sacred meaning. Feathers were perhaps the most striking of all. To the Aztecs, feathers were not decoration but symbols of life itself. Birds soared where humans could not. Their plumage carried the colours of the sky, the jungle, the divine. Among feathers, the most prized were those of the quetzal, long and shimmering green, rare and difficult to obtain. Quetzal birds lived far to the south, in humid forests. To capture one without killing it, to pluck only its tail feathers and release it, required skill and patience. These feathers travelled hundreds of miles to Tenochtitlan, where artisans wove them into headdresses, capes and shields. To see a noble draped in quetzal feathers was to see wealth carried on air. Such adornments were so prized that only rulers and high priests could wear them. To a commoner, possession of such feathers without permission was punishable by death. Each of these materials, turquoise, obsidian, feathers, was woven into daily life, yet always with layers of meaning. A turquoise mosaic mask was not only beautiful, it was a face of the divine, used in ceremonies. An obsidian knife was not only sharp, it was the instrument of sacrifice, connecting human hearts to the gods. A feather headdress was not only ornament, it was authority made visible, the embodiment of status. Together they formed the language of prestige, a visual grammar that told society who was noble, who was priest, who held power. Acquiring these materials required vast networks. Turquoise came from distant lands, feathers from jungles, obsidian from volcanic regions. Tribute ensured their flow. Provinces delivered feathers in bundles, turquoise in fragments, obsidian in blocks. Artisans in Tenochtitlan transformed them into objects of splendour. Feather workers, or a mantica, were highly skilled. Their craft passed down through generations. They worked in secrecy, cutting, gluing, layering feathers to form images of gods, shields of dazzling colour, cloaks that shimmered with light. Stonecutters shaped turquoise into delicate tesserae, fitting them into masks with resin, each piece no larger than a fingernail. Obsidian nappers struck stone against stone, producing blades so thin they could slice hair. These labours were precise, repetitive, demanding, boring in detail yet magnificent in result. Pause and imagine a workshop. A feather worker sits cross-legged, arranging tiny feathers with tweezers made of bone. He works slowly, layering colours into a mosaic that will adorn a noble's shield. Nearby, an obsidian napper strikes stone, chips flying as he forms a blade. Another artisan fits turquoise onto a wooden mask, each piece aligned carefully, the pattern emerging only after hours of work. The air smells of resin, of dust, of feathers. The sound is of scraping, tapping, cutting. Nothing dramatic, only patience. Yet from this patience comes beauty that commands respect. But prestige was not only beauty, it was control. To own turquoise, obsidian, or feathers was to signal one's place in hierarchy. Nobles adorned themselves, priests carried ritual objects, rulers displayed treasures. Commoners saw these objects and knew their meaning. They did not need to be told. The materials spoke for themselves. In this way, prestige was maintained not by words alone, but by colour, by shimmer, by shine. To deny a noble his turquoise, his feathers, his obsidian was to deny his identity. The empire therefore guarded these materials fiercely. Still, one must ask, why did these particular materials matter so much? Why turquoise, obsidian, feathers, and not others? Perhaps because they embodied contrasts. Turquoise was rare, distant, fragile. Obsidian was common, sharp, dangerous. Feathers were light, colourful, ephemeral. Together they balanced permanence and fragility, earth and sky, war and beauty. They mirrored the Aztec worldview itself, built on dualities, on the fleeting and the eternal intertwined. And yet, one question lingers as the artisans labour. If prestige was built on such fragile and distant materials, what happened when the networks faltered, when conquest came, when the supply of turquoise, obsidian and feathers was disrupted? Prestige did not exist in isolation. It was sustained by systems, tribute flows, artisan workshops, and rules that dictated who could wear or use what. The materials themselves, turquoise, obsidian, feathers, were merely starting points. What gave them weight in Aztec society was the machinery behind them, the endless routines of collection, transport and regulation. Prestige was not accidental. It was managed, policed, and displayed through networks as complex as the empire itself. The tribute system was the backbone. Provinces far from the Valley of Mexico were compelled to send goods regularly. Cloth, food, weapons, and crucially feathers, turquoise, and obsidian. Codices record these obligations with careful glyphs. Bundles of quetzal feathers tied with cords, turquoise stones drawn as small blue ovals, obsidian knives shown with gleaming black blades. Each province owed a specific quota, due every 80 or 180 days. The records look repetitive, almost dull. Numbers, items, cycles. Yet behind each entry was a village harvesting feathers, a caravan hauling turquoise, a quarry of workers chipping obsidian. Tribute was not glamour, it was monotony, turned into grandeur only at its destination. The transport of materials was itself laborious. Porters bore loads strapped to their foreheads, walking for days along causeways and mountain roads. Quetzal feathers came from tropical forests in present-day Guatemala, carried carefully so their long plumes were not damaged. Turquoise travelled from deserts of the north, exchanged hand to hand through long chains of trade. Obsidian, though local, still required quarrying, shaping and transport. Each material embodied distance, weight and work. By the time they reached Tenochtitlan, they were freighted not only with physical value, but with the sweat of countless labourers. Artisans too were bound to these materials. Feather workers, a manteca, were highly respected yet tightly controlled. They worked in specialised districts, often hereditary guilds, their skills passed down within families. Hours were spent cutting tiny feathers, arranging them with resin on wooden frames, layering colours to form shimmering mosaics. Their work was painstaking, repetitive, requiring focus and patience. It was not unlike the work of women at Metetes, monotonous, body-wearing, yet essential. Obsidian nappers faced similar tedium. They struck stone against stone thousands of times, producing blades by the dozen, most of which broke before perfection was achieved. Turquoise inlayers sat hunched over wooden masks or shields, fitting each fragment like a puzzle piece, careful not to chip fragile edges. These artisans rarely saw their creations in use. Once finished, the objects left their workshops for noble hands. Despite their skill, artisans were not free. The materials they worked with belonged to the state, not to them. Their output was destined for rulers, priests and warriors. Regulations governed who could wear what. A commoner could not don a quetzal feather headdress without permission. Turquoise ornaments were forbidden to most. Even obsidian, though widespread, was restricted in its ornamental use. The law enforced hierarchy through materials. Prestige was not simply wealth, it was permission, bestowed by rank. A man could be rich in beans or cloth, but without noble status, he could not wear turquoise mosaics or quetzal feathers. The materials marked difference, visible at a glance, policed by both custom and law. Public display reinforced this difference. Festivals filled plazas with colour, nobles draped in feather cloaks, warriors wearing turquoise masks, priests holding obsidian knives that caught the sun. Commoners watched, their eyes drawn to the shimmer, their minds reminded of hierarchy. The materials were not hidden in treasuries, they were meant to be seen. Their beauty was political, their rarity a tool of control. The empire did not only demand tribute, it showed it off, turning distance and labour into symbols of power visible in every ceremony. Feathers floated above crowds, turquoise glittered in torchlight, obsidian gleamed black against white plaster. Each object spoke silently. This is order. This is rank. This is empire. Yet behind the shimmer was fragility. Tribute lists reveal constant repetition. Again and again, provinces owing feathers, stones, blades. The demand never ceased. A single missed shipment could signal rebellion. A shortage of feathers could disrupt ceremonies. Obsidian, though abundant, still required endless quarrying. Turquoise, rare and distant, was especially precarious. The entire system depended on constant flows of fragile goods. If networks broke, prestige faltered. Nobles without feathers, priests without obsidian, rulers without turquoise, such absences could undermine authority. Prestige, so dazzling in appearance, rested on tedious repetition in reality. Artisans knew this fragility intimately. A broken turquoise fragment wasted hours. A bent feather ruined a mosaic. A flawed obsidian strike shattered a blade. Their workshops were places of patience and loss, where many attempts failed before success emerged. The public saw only perfection, the gleaming shield, the shimmering headdress. They did not see the piles of broken shards, the discarded feathers, the tired eyes of artisans who worked for weeks on objects displayed for a single ceremony. Prestige depended on invisibility, the invisibility of labour, of error, of monotony. Consider again the public spectacle. A noble stands in the plaza, adorned in turquoise and feathers, obsidian knife in hand. The crowd murmurs in awe, but behind him lie weeks of porters walking, artisans bending, tribute collectors tallying, workers quarrying. None of this is seen. Prestige is a mask, its beauty concealing the boring details that sustain it. The shimmer hides the sweat. And yet, perhaps this was the point. For the Aztecs, appearance and reality were intertwined. To show feathers was to prove control of jungles hundreds of miles away. To wear turquoise was to embody rivers and skies brought under tribute. To wield obsidian was to hold the cutting edge of Earth itself. The boring details of transport and labour were absorbed into the brilliance of ceremony. The monotony became meaning. Prestige was not only in the object but in the invisible system behind it. But here a question arises. What happened when conquest disrupted these flows? When the Spanish severed tribute networks, seized workshops and sought gold instead of turquoise, how did the materials of prestige fare? Could turquoise, obsidian and feathers retain meaning in a new order, or did they fade into relics of a lost world? When the Spanish conquest tore through Tenochtitlan, the materials that had defined Aztec prestige did not vanish instantly. Turquoise, obsidian and feathers remained present, still tangible, still visible. But their meanings shifted. What had once been the grammar of authority for an empire became curiosities, commodities, or relics under colonial rule. Prestige, once defined by shimmering mosaics and feathered cloaks, was redefined in gold and silver, in European fabrics, in symbols, foreign to Mesoamerica. The fall of the Aztec world was not only military or political, it was also material. The empire's prestige unravelled as its materials lost place. Turquoise was one of the first to fade. The Spanish, enamoured with gold and silver, paid little attention to it. To them, turquoise was semi-precious at best, decorative but not wealth. The mosaics that had adorned masks and shields were often dismantled, their stones pried out, discarded or sent to Europe as curiosities. Some found their way into collections, admired for craftsmanship but stripped of meaning. The networks that once carried turquoise from northern deserts collapsed. Tribute lists ceased, and the blue-green stone disappeared from prominence. What had mirrored sky and water in Aztec thought became, in colonial hands, nothing more than ornament, its sacred resonance lost. Obsidian fared differently. Its utility ensured survival. Spaniards quickly recognized its sharpness and used it for tools where steel was scarce. In villages, obsidian continued to serve for knives, scrapers, and arrowheads long after conquest. But as European metal spread, obsidian declined in practical use. Its role in ritual, as mirrors and sacrificial blades, was deliberately suppressed. Priests carrying obsidian knives were replaced by Catholic clergy carrying crosses. Divination with obsidian mirrors was condemned as idolatry. What had once been a medium of vision became superstition. Yet obsidian never disappeared entirely. Its abundance kept it present, its gleam still valued. Even today, obsidian is sold in Mexican markets as souvenirs, mirrors, figurines, jewellery, its ancient prestige lingering faintly, though now as heritage rather than hierarchy. Feathers suffered a transformation most striking of all. The feather workers, a mantica, continued their craft under Spanish rule, but now their patrons were different. Instead of making headdresses for emperors, they crafted feather mosaics of Christian images, saints, virgins, crucifixes. The same delicate skill, the same layering of shimmering colours, but directed toward new symbols. The artistry endured, but the meaning changed. What once symbolised divine kingship now adorned Catholic altars. In this way, feathers carried continuity through transformation. The shimmer remained, though its voice spoke a new language. Still, the work of the Amantica was admired, even in Europe, where feather mosaics sent across the Atlantic astonished audiences unfamiliar with such delicacy. Prestige shifted from empire to empire, yet the feathers continued to dazzle. But for common people, the shift was profound. No longer did turquoise, obsidian, and feathers mark rank in the same way. Spanish sumptuary laws imposed new restrictions, forbidding indigenous nobles from displaying old symbols of power. European cloth, jewellery, and weaponry replaced local hierarchies. The visual language of prestige, once immediately legible in colours and textures, was replaced by another foreign system. To an Aztec eye, the loss was not merely political, it was sensory. The plazas no longer shimmered with quetzal feathers, ceremonies no longer gleamed with turquoise mosaics. The black gleam of obsidian knives no longer cut through ritual. The sensory world of empire had ended, and yet traces remained. In rural communities, feathers still adorned local rituals. Obsidian blades were still used in healing practices. Mirrors still employed for divination, though quietly, away from clerical eyes. Turquoise, though diminished, survived in fragments, sometimes treasured in families as heirlooms. These materials lingered not as public prestige, but as private memory, carried forward quietly by those who remembered. Colonial authorities might suppress, but memory seeped through daily life. In the long view of history, the endurance of these materials lies not in their old meanings, but in their adaptability. Turquoise is still admired, though now as jewellery. Obsidian still gleams, its mirrors sold in markets, its blades studied by archaeologists. Feathers still shimmer, not on emperors' headdresses, but on folkloric costumes, carnival masks, festival dances. The Aztec Empire is gone, but its materials remain woven into modern identity. Their prestige has changed form, but not vanished. Pause, then, and reflect. What makes a material prestigious? Is it rarity, beauty, or the systems that assign meaning? For the Aztecs, turquoise, obsidian, and feathers were prestigious because they linked earth and sky, labour and hierarchy, body and spirit. For the Spanish, they were curiosities, stripped of sacredness. For us today, they are heritage, windows into a world lost but not forgotten. Their meanings have shifted, but they continue to carry weight. Prestige, it seems, is never permanent. It is always redefined by those who control it. Picture one last time the plaza of Tenochtitlan before conquest. Nobles shimmer in quetzal feathers, turquoise mosaics glitter in sunlight, obsidian knives gleam black. The crowd murmurs in awe. Now picture the same plaza after conquest. Feathers are gone, turquoise scattered, obsidian suppressed. In their place, silver crosses gleam, European banners fly, new hierarchies rise. The sensory world has changed, but beneath it, memory lingers. Even today, when you see a turquoise stone, an obsidian mirror, or a feathered costume in Mexico, you glimpse an echo of that world, a shimmer of lost prestige. And so, the question remains: when empires fall, Do their materials lose meaning, or do they carry fragments of memory forward, reshaped, reimagined, enduring in ways their makers never foresaw? In the still waters of ancient lakes, farmers stepped barefoot onto chinampas, floating fields where green rose grew from mud, reeds, and unending labour. When you imagine the Valley of Mexico at its height, you must picture water as much as land. Tenochtitlan rose from the surface of Lake Texcoco, its causeways binding it to the shore, its canals threading neighbourhoods like streets. But beyond the city's temples and palaces stretched something less dramatic, though far more essential: the chinampas, the floating fields that fed the empire. To walk among them was not to see grandeur, but to witness monotony. Endless rectangles of earth rising from the water, tended daily, season after season, by men and women whose labour made survival possible. Chinampas were not truly floating. They were engineered islands built with patience and repetition. Farmers drove stakes into the shallow lake bed, marking a rectangle. Between these stakes they wove reeds, forming a frame. Into this frame they piled mud, silt, and decaying vegetation, dredged from canals. Slowly the rectangle rose above water, forming a strip of fertile soil. Trees were planted at the corners, willows, ahuejotes, whose roots anchored the island in place. Over years the soil thickened, enriched by constant renewal. What emerged was a chinampa, narrow, rectangular, fertile, bordered by canals. Side by side, hundreds, then thousands, formed a patchwork of green across the lakes. The work of building chinampas was boring, backbreaking, and endless. Mud had to be dredged from canals daily. Vegetation had to be cut, piled, allowed to rot. Stakes rotted and had to be replaced. Trees grew slowly, their roots weaving into the soil. Nothing about it was quick or glamorous, yet the result was extraordinary. Some of the most productive farmland in the world. Chinampas could yield multiple harvests per year. Maize, beans, chilies, squash, tomatoes, all thrived in their rich soil. What common fields produced once, chinampas produced 2 or 3 times. They fed not only households, but entire cities. Step into this landscape in your mind. You see a grid of long, narrow fields, perhaps 30 feet wide, several hundred feet long, each bordered by a canal. Men in canoes glide between them, poles pushing against the shallow water. Women work the soil, planting seedlings, pulling weeds. Children carry baskets of silt, dumping them onto the rows. The air smells of mud, damp reeds, and fresh leaves. Birds call overhead, reeds rustle in the wind. It is not dramatic, not loud, only the steady, quiet rhythm of labour. The chinampas stretch outward, an endless quilt of green stitched with water. The daily work never ceased. At dawn, farmers paddled canoes to their fields. They weeded rows, checked irrigation channels, dredged fresh mud to spread as fertilizer. Each motion was repeated endlessly. Scoop mud, lift, dump, spread. The monotony was unrelenting, but the system worked. Families sustained themselves and markets in Tenochtitlan overflowed with produce. Chroniclers described the markets with awe. Piles of tomatoes, chilies, beans and maize, enough to feed tens of thousands. Behind that abundance lay the chinampas, and behind the chinampas the endless labour of farmers. The canals themselves required constant maintenance. They silted up, clogged with weeds, collapsed at their edges. Farmers cleared them with poles and baskets, dredging muck to restore depth. Canoes carried goods to market, gliding silently through waterways. The city's bustle depended on these narrow channels, invisible to outsiders but essential to survival. Without clear canals, the fields could not be reached, the crops not transported. The farmers, therefore, laboured not only on land but on water, repairing, dredging, maintaining. It was, like grinding maize or sweeping courtyards, invisible labour that underpinned grandeur. Chinampas also shaped social life. Families inherited plots, passing them from generation to generation. Boundaries were marked by trees, canals, or rows of reeds. Disputes arose, settled by local officials. Tribute lists required produce from chinampas, loads of maize, chilies, flowers, sent regularly to Tenochtitlan. Farmers thus worked not only for themselves but for empire. Each row of maize bent in the wind was part of a larger network of tribute and survival. The monotony of hoeing, weeding, planting, harvesting, was linked directly to the grandeur of palaces, the feasts of nobles, the sacrifices of temples. The gods were fed with tamales, but the tamales began in mud, dredged at dawn by ordinary hands. The chinampas were also places of community. Families worked side by side, their fields bordering each other, their canoes passing on narrow canals. Songs might rise, conversations drift across water. Children learned to paddle, to weed, to plant. The knowledge of chinampa farming was not written in codices but carried in memory, taught by repetition. A boy learned to balance a canoe by falling into the canal again and again until he did not. A girl learned to plant seedlings by kneeling in mud, fingers pressing stalks into soil. The lessons were boring, slow, patient, but they endured, as surely as the fields did. Pause, and imagine standing at the edge of this watery grid. The city rises in the distance, its temples gleaming white, its markets humming. But here, all you hear is the splash of a pole, the call of a farmer to his child, the scrape of a shovel through mud. The grandeur of empire rests silently on this labour, invisible in ceremony but essential in truth. The chinampas were not floating gardens of beauty as later writers called them, but floating fields of endless work. And yet one question lingers. If chinampas sustained the Aztec Empire with such abundance, what happened to them when the empire fell, when conquest disrupted tribute and canals, when new rulers neglected the monotony of maintenance? The abundance of chinampas, so often praised by chroniclers, was never simply abundance. It was structured, monitored, and demanded. Each chinampa plot, each harvest of maize or chilies, was tied not only to family survival, but also to tribute owed to the empire. The farmers who knelt in mud were not free to keep all that they grew. Their labour sustained their households, yes, but it also fed the nobility, stocked markets, and supplied temples. Behind the shimmering image of Tenochtitlan's bustling plazas lay the invisible weight of obligation, measured in baskets of maize carried by canoe from chinampa to city. Tribute was relentless. Codices list the quotas: baskets of maize, bundles of chilies, loads of beans and squash. Flowers too were demanded for ceremonies and offerings. The records are repetitive, each province tied to specific cycles of delivery, every 80 days, every 180 days. The dullness of these lists masks their burden. Farmers worked not only to feed their families but to meet imperial quotas. A poor harvest could mean hardship, not just at home, but in negotiations with officials who expected their due. To live on a chinampa was to live under constant pressure. The soil fertile, the work abundant, but the obligations endless. The cycles of planting and harvest dictated time itself. Unlike dry fields that depended on rain, chinampas allowed near-constant cultivation. Their irrigation came from canals, their fertility from dredged mud. Farmers planted maize, beans and squash together, the traditional triad supporting each other in growth. Between these rows grew chilies, tomatoes and herbs. After one harvest, another could follow, the soil replenished by fresh silt. The result was abundance, yes, but also unending labour. There was no true rest, no season of stillness. The fields demanded attention throughout the year. To own a chinampa was to own both fertility and obligation, a gift that was also a burden. The monotony of cycles was profound. At dawn, farmers paddled out, checked water levels, weeded rows, pulled up seedlings. At midday, they dredged mud, hauling basket after basket from canals, spreading it across beds, patting it flat with hands and feet. At dusk, they harvested what ripened, tied it into bundles, loaded canoes. The next day, the same. Week after week, season after season, year after year. A life of chinampas was a life of repetition, the body bent in familiar motions, the mind shaped by routine. It was work that could be forgotten in records but never forgotten in flesh. Yet fragility lurked beneath this abundance. The fertility of chinampas depended on constant maintenance. If canals clogged, if mud was not dredged, if weeds spread unchecked, productivity faltered. A single year of neglect could undo years of building. Tribute officials might still demand quotas, leaving families hungry. Floods too threatened chinampas, drowning crops, eroding soil. Droughts lowered lake levels, drying canals, cutting irrigation. The very system that promised stability was in fact precarious. balanced on constant human effort. There was no permanence, only cycles, fragile and repetitive. The empire, however, relied on this abundance as if it were permanent. Markets in Tlatelolco overflowed with produce, piles of maize, heaps of chilies, baskets of beans. Chroniclers marvelled at the sight, noting thousands of buyers and sellers, the richness of food unmatched in Europe. But these markets did not reflect leisure. They reflected labour. Every pile of tomatoes represented hours of paddling, planting, weeding. Every basket of beans echoed the scrape of mud hauled from canals. The spectacle of abundance in markets concealed the monotony behind it, just as feathered headdresses concealed the labour of artisans. Empire turned labour into spectacle, invisibility into display. The Chinampas also tied households to empire in a way difficult to escape. Unlike tribute in cacao or feathers, which came from distant provinces, Chinampa tribute came from the very heart of the Valley of Mexico. Farmers nearest the capital carried a double burden. Their labour fed their families and sustained the capital's constant demand. Resistance was difficult. Rebellion in distant provinces might disrupt tribute flows, but neglect of Chinampas near Tenochtitlan would be noticed at once. The proximity of fields to city meant constant scrutiny. The canals that carried produce also carried oversight. Chinampa farmers, though near the centre of empire, were tightly bound by its reach. Pause now and imagine such a life. You rise at dawn, paddle your canoe to narrow fields. You bend, weed, dredge, plant. By midday your back aches, your arms burn. You eat a simple tortilla, perhaps with beans or chili, then return to work. By dusk you load produce into your canoe, deliver it to market, count out tribute owed. You return home, exhausted, knowing tomorrow will be the same. Around you, hundreds of families do the same, their fields aligned in endless rows, their labour invisible except in the abundance it produces. It is not glorious, but it is survival. It is not celebrated, but it sustains empire. And yet the question persists. If Chinampas demanded such constant effort, what happened when conquest disrupted the cycles, when canals fell into disrepair, when tribute shifted to new masters? Could the floating fields endure under such strain, or would they fade into memory like the feathers and turquoise of old prestige? When Tenochtitlan fell in 1521, its temples burned, its palaces ruined, yet the Chinampas did not disappear. While the city crumbled under siege, while smoke and famine filled the air, farmers still tended narrow fields, dredged canals, planted maize. Even as the empire collapsed, tortillas still needed to be made, markets still needed food. The Spanish were astonished to find that amid ruins, the floating fields endured. In fact, they came to rely on them, for maize and vegetables from Chinampas fed not only indigenous survivors, but also the conquerors who now occupied the valley. In the early colonial years, the productivity of Chinampas continued almost unchanged. Spaniards marvelled at their abundance, recording that harvests came 2 and even 3 times a year. Canoes still glided through canals, carrying beans, chilies, squash and flowers to city markets. Tribute was redirected, no longer to Aztec nobles and temples, but to encomenderos and colonial authorities. The faces of officials changed, but the demands did not. Farmers remained bound to their fields, their labour still invisible yet essential. The monotony continued, only under new masters. Over time, however, neglect crept in. The great system of canals that had tied Chinampas together required constant maintenance, and colonial authorities did not manage it with the same vigilance. Canals silted, fields eroded, water levels shifted. Spanish building projects drained parts of the lake, altering the delicate balance of water and soil. Floods struck more frequently, sometimes overwhelming Chinampas, sometimes leaving them dry. Farmers struggled to adapt, repairing what they could, but the system weakened. The floating quilt of fields shrank, and some were abandoned altogether. Yet Chinampas did not vanish. In certain areas, especially in Xochimilco, they survived through centuries of change. Families continued to work them, passing plots from parent to child, maintaining traditions of dredging mud, planting rows, anchoring with trees. Spanish crops, wheat, barley, were grown elsewhere, but Chinampas remained tied to maize, beans, chilies and vegetables. Over time, they became known not only for food, but for flowers. Canoes laden with blossoms glided into Mexico City markets, just as they had in Tenochtitlan, offering colour and fragrance amid stone streets. The monotony of dredging and planting became, in part, a symbol of continuity, of indigenous resilience under colonial rule. By the 19th century, chinampas were fewer but still recognised as marvels. Travellers from Europe wrote of floating gardens, romanticising them as picturesque relics of a vanished world. They admired the rows of flowers, the canals reflecting sky, the willows shading paths. What they did not see, or did not choose to see, was the labour. They overlooked the bent backs of farmers dredging muck, the repetition of planting and weeding, the dull routine that sustained beauty. The gardens were not romantic. They were work, but to outsiders they became spectacle once more, stripped of monotony, displayed as heritage. Today, chinampas survive in fragments. In Xochimilco, south of Mexico City, farmers still tend them. Canoes still glide through canals, though now many carry tourists as well as produce. Flowers are grown for sale, vegetables for local markets. The sound of dredging, the smell of mud, the rhythm of planting persists. The system is smaller, threatened by urban growth, pollution, neglect. But it endures. The chinampas remain a living link to the world of Tenochtitlan, a reminder that empires may fall but the labour of survival continues. What do they tell us? That resilience often hides in monotony. The Aztec Empire celebrated warriors and rulers, yet its survival depended more on farmers who dredged mud at dawn. The Spanish built churches and drained lakes, yet still relied on chinampas to feed their cities. Today, tourists photograph colourful canoes among flowers, yet the soil beneath still bears the imprint of centuries of hands. The chinampas endure not because they are glamorous, but because they are boring, rows of mud, trees, water, dredged endlessly, sustaining life quietly. Pause and picture them now. Narrow fields stretch beside canals, green rows reflected in water. A farmer kneels, pressing seedlings into soil. His canoe lies nearby, piled with mud dredged that morning. Birds call in reeds, wind rustles willows. The work is the same as 500 years ago. Forward, back, plant, weed, scoop, spread. A rhythm of labour repeated across generations. It is not dramatic, but it is eternal. The chinampas remind us that history is carried less by battles than by fields, less by rulers than by labourers, less by noise than by silence. And so we end with a question. When we think of civilizations, do we remember the glory of temples and warriors, or the monotony of fields that fed them? The chinampas, still alive in fragments, suggest the answer. Survival lies in the boring work, the endless repetition, the floating fields of labour. Beneath the morning sun, the markets of Tlatelolco stirred with traders' voices as salt, chili and maize changed hands in measured daily rhythm. The Aztec Empire is often remembered for its temples, its warriors, its sacrifices, but its daily life pulsed most strongly in the marketplace. Of these, none was greater than Tlatelolco, the twin city of Tenochtitlan. Here, under the open sky, thousands gathered each day to buy and sell, to trade and barter, to gossip and observe. Chroniclers wrote of its size with astonishment. Tens of thousands of people, rows upon rows of vendors, goods from across the empire. Yet the grandeur of the market was built not only on luxury items like jade or quetzal feathers, but on ordinary goods: salt, chili, maize. These three, humble, repetitive, unchanging, formed the pillars of daily sustenance. Without them, no family could survive, no household could function. They were not glamorous, but they were everything. Salt came first. In a landlocked valley surrounded by lakes, salt was both abundant and essential. From the brackish waters of Lake Texcoco, salt workers scraped, dried and collected crystals, forming cakes for sale. These were carried to market stacked in neat piles, exchanged for beans, cloth or cacao. Salt preserved food, flavoured meals and sustained health. Every family needed it, every market sold it. The work of harvesting salt was repetitive, monotonous, waiting for water to evaporate, scraping residue, drying it in the sun. But in Tlatelolco it became currency, its dull white stacks shining against reed mats. Buyers carried it home in baskets, vendors counted it in cakes, officials recorded its tribute. Salt was ordinary, but it was survival. Chili gave life flavour. Dried red chilies, smoked chipotle, fresh green pods, all filled the market with colour and smell. Vendors sold them by handfuls or baskets, their pungent scent stinging the air. Without chili, meals were bland. Maize gruel, beans, tortillas, all required spice to be satisfying. Families bought chilies daily, grinding them into sauces, mixing them with tomatoes, blending them with herbs. The work of chili was tedious, harvesting pods, drying them, stringing them together, carrying them in loads to market. Yet in Tlatelolco, chilies filled stalls with brightness, with sharpness, with fire. They were cheap enough for commoners, valuable enough for tribute, universal in demand. The empire may have been built on maize, but it was flavoured by chili. And maize, above all, was the foundation. In the market, piles of ears stood tall, kernels in every shade of white, yellow, red, and blue. Baskets of dried kernels sat beside fresh tortillas, stacks of tamales steamed in husks, atole sold in clay cups. Everywhere you looked, maize was present, transformed into endless forms. Families bought kernels to grind at home, or tortillas already patted and toasted. Vendors sold tamales wrapped and ready for workers to eat on the go. Maize was food, identity, and myth. It was not luxury, it was life itself. And in Tlatelolco, its presence was overwhelming, as essential as air. The market itself was a world of order within chaos. Vendors sat in rows according to goods, one section for salt, another for chilies, another for maize. Buyers wove through alleys, baskets on backs, children in tow. Judges patrolled, ensuring fairness, punishing fraud. Announcers cried out disputes, settled by officials. The hum of voices rose like a tide, haggling, gossiping, calling. The air was filled with smells, smoke from cooked tamales, sharpness of chili, sweetness of fruit, mustiness of beans. It was not a place of silence, but of constant noise, constant movement. Yet within the bustle was routine. Every day the same goods appeared, the same transactions repeated. The market was both dynamic and monotonous, both alive and predictable. Step closer to a vendor's mat. You see cakes of salt stacked neatly, each nearly identical. A woman counts them carefully, exchanges them for a small pouch of cacao. Beside her, another woman sells chilies, their red skins bright against woven mats. She pours a handful into a customer's cloth, accepts beans in return. A third vendor sells maize, scooping kernels into a basket, weighing with practiced eye. The transactions are quick, repetitive, boring in detail, but multiplied by thousands, they form the heartbeat of empire. Tlatelolco thrived not on spectacle, but on endless small exchanges of salt, chili, and maize. The Spanish, upon arrival, marvelled at the scale. Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote of the vast market, greater than anything in Spain, filled with every good imaginable. Yet he too noted the ordinariness: salt, maize, beans, chilies everywhere. To him it was astonishing that such abundance could rest on such humble goods. But to the Aztecs, there was nothing strange. These were the necessities, the pillars, the things without which life collapsed. Warriors might fight, nobles might command, priests might sacrifice, but all required tortillas spiced with chili, all required salt to preserve and flavour. Without these, empire itself would crumble. Pause now, and imagine walking the rows. You hear voices haggling, smell chilies drying in the sun, see piles of maize stacked high. The goods are not glamorous. They are not turquoise, feathers, or gold, but they matter more. They sustain bodies, shape meals, bind community. In their repetition lies stability, in their monotony lies survival. And yet, a question lingers. If markets thrived on salt, chili, and maize, how did they manage scarcity? What happened when harvests failed, when drought struck, when prices rose beyond reach? Could even the mighty market of Tlatelolco withstand the fragility of dependence on ordinary goods? Abundance dazzled visitors to Tlatelolco, but abundance was never guaranteed. Behind the piles of maize, the heaps of chili, the cakes of salt, There was fragility. Droughts, floods, pests, or war could disrupt supply. A failed maize harvest did not merely tighten belts, it threatened survival. The markets managed this fragility through rules, oversight, and constant vigilance. But the balance was delicate. Every tortilla eaten in Tenochtitlan depended on invisible threads of weather, labour, and trade. Scarcity was most feared in maize. It was not simply a food, but the foundation of existence, the very flesh of humanity in Aztec belief. A drought in the valley could devastate local harvests. When this happened, prices rose sharply. A basket of maize that once cost 20 cacao beans might double, then triple. Families struggled, commoners suffered. The markets recorded this fragility in silence. Stalls less full, voices more tense, coins and beans counted more carefully. Scarcity pressed like a shadow over the plaza. Officials tried to regulate prices, to prevent hoarding, to ensure fairness. But they could not control the sky. Famine haunted the Aztec world, always one failed season away. Chili, though less essential than maize, was no less vulnerable. Drought stunted crops, heavy rains rotted pods, pests stripped plants. Scarcity of chili did not starve families, but it changed meals profoundly. A tortilla without chili was bland, unsatisfying. To eat such food was to feel poor, deprived not of calories, but of taste. In famine years, families ground maize into tortillas, but lacked chili to season them. Meals filled stomachs but did not bring satisfaction. Hunger was endured, but flavour was lost. The absence of chili was thus more than culinary, it was cultural. It reminded families of fragility, of dependence on the delicate balance of soil and rain. Salt, though abundant from the lakes, was not immune to disruption. Workers had to scrape it daily, drying it in sun, collecting it before rains dissolved crystals. Political upheaval could block access to lake shores, tribute disputes could withhold supplies, floods could submerge pans. A shortage of salt did not kill, but it weakened. Without salt, food spoiled faster, bodies ached for minerals, prices rose, disputes flared. A family could eat maize and chili but still suffer without salt. It was as essential as it was ordinary. Fraud compounded scarcity. In Tlatelolco, vigilance was constant. Vendors sometimes mixed stones with salt, selling by weight. Chilies might be dyed or dampened to appear fresher. Maize kernels might be old, worm-eaten, disguised in baskets. Judges patrolled markets to catch such deception. Punishments could be harsh. Confiscation, public shaming, even beatings. Fraud threatened not just buyers but the system itself. Trust was fragile. A market of deception could not sustain an empire. Officials therefore guarded honesty fiercely, walking rows, listening for disputes, enforcing order. The abundance of Tlatelolco was as much discipline as it was fertility. Price control was another tool. Officials set limits, ensuring that vendors could not exploit scarcity too freely. Yet control was imperfect. In years of poor harvest, prices rose regardless. Families turned to substitutes, more beans, more herbs, less maize. Tamales grew smaller, tortillas thinner. The wealthy still ate, the poor suffered more. The market reflected inequality, even amid abundance. Nobles could afford higher prices, while commoners cut meals in half. The plaza with its rows of goods looked full, but behind the scene hunger grew. And still, the market endured. Its size, its organisation, its rules allowed it to absorb shocks better than scattered villages might. Canoes brought food from distant regions, filling stalls even when local harvests failed. Tribute caravans delivered goods regardless of drought in one province, for others compensated. Tlatelolco's strength lay in scale. It drew from across the empire, reducing the risk of total collapse. Yet fragility lingered. The more the empire demanded tribute, the more pressure weighed on provinces. A bad season far away still rippled into the plaza, its silence marked in the price of tortillas and the scarcity of chili smoke in the air. Pause now and imagine a day of scarcity. The market is quieter, the piles smaller, salt cakes are fewer, chilies scarcer, maize dearer. Buyers argue more, count beans more carefully, judges intervene more often, vendors defend their prices, buyers protest, tempers flare. Children clutch smaller tortillas, families carry home less. The plaza still hums, but the hum is strained. Scarcity makes itself heard in whispers and silences, in smaller bundles, in thinner stews. The market still functions, but it functions under shadow. Fragility, always present, steps into view. And yet, this fragility raises a question. How did such markets preserve trust and stability across generations, ensuring that even in times of scarcity, they did not collapse into chaos? To understand why Tlatelolco endured as the great marketplace of the Aztec world, you must look not only at goods and prices but also at order. A market of tens of thousands could not survive without trust. Buyers had to believe that salt was truly salt, that chili was fresh, that maize was fit to grind. Vendors had to trust that payments, whether cacao beans, cloth or labour, would be honoured. Without such trust, the vast hum of the plaza would collapse into chaos. What sustained Tlatelolco, therefore, was not abundance alone, but discipline, enforced daily through judges, ritual and reputation. Order was carefully maintained. Judges, known as Tianquispan Tlayacanqui, patrolled the rows. They listened for disputes, settled arguments, punished fraud. Their presence was constant, their authority respected. Vendors who cheated risked not only confiscation of goods but public shame. Punishments were often immediate and visible, reinforcing rules through example. To cheat in Tlatelolco was to risk reputation in a city where reputation mattered. Word spread quickly across rows, and a dishonest vendor might find customers gone, trust broken. In this way, order was preserved not only by law but by community memory. Ritual too played its part. Markets were not secular spaces, they were bound to the sacred rhythms of the calendar. Certain days carried special significance, linked to gods and festivals. Offerings might be made before stalls opened, prayers whispered before sales began. The gods of commerce and trade, Tenochtitlan among them, were honoured with incense and flowers. Vendors tied bundles of goods with cords, symbols of the god's staff. These rituals reinforced the idea that markets were not simply economic exchanges, but spiritual acts. Buying maize or salt was, in its way, participation in divine order. This belief added weight to honesty, for to cheat was not only to offend buyers but to dishonour gods. Reputation formed another pillar. Families often sold the same goods for generations, salt from one lineage, chilies from another, maize from a third. Buyers returned to familiar vendors, building bonds of trust over years. A woman who sold chilies might be known across the market for her fairness, her produce, her constancy. Customers sought her out, bypassing others. Trust was built through repetition, through the boring reliability of showing up day after day with the same goods, measured the same way. In this sense, markets were sustained less by spectacle than by monotony. Stability lay in sameness. The Spanish, upon arrival, marvelled at this order. Hernán Cortés described the market as greater than any in Europe, noting not only its size but its discipline. Bernal Díaz del Castillo wrote of judges enforcing rules, of goods, arranged in orderly rows, of prices maintained. To outsiders it seemed astonishing that tens of thousands could gather without chaos. To the Aztecs it was expected. Markets were as much about order as about exchange. The same goods, salt, chili, maize, appeared daily, arranged in familiar places, sold by familiar hands. The market was vast, but it was also predictable. Its greatness lay not only in scale but in repetition. The legacy of Tlatelolco lies partly in this order. When the Spanish destroyed Tenochtitlan, they did not destroy its marketplace. Instead, they used it. The city still needed food, still needed exchange. The market, so deeply rooted in rhythm and routine, endured beyond conquest. Over time, it changed. European goods appeared, Spanish coins replaced cacao beans, but the structure of order remained. Even today, markets in Mexico echo this legacy. Rows of vendors, sections for specific goods, trust built on reputation, rituals tied to Catholic saints. These are continuities, faint but real, linking modern Tianguis to ancient Tlatelolco. Pause now and imagine the market at its height one last time. The sun rises, vendors arrange goods on reed mats. Cakes of salt are stacked, chilies spread, maize piled. Buyers arrive, baskets on backs, children in tow. Judges patrol, priests light incense, vendors call out. The air fills with smells. Chili sharp, maize sweet, salt brainy. Voices rise, transactions repeat. Nothing spectacular happens. No battles, no conquests, no speeches. Only exchange, ordinary and endless. Yet in this ordinariness lies greatness. The market fed an empire, sustained families, preserved trust. It was boring, yes, but in its monotony lay survival. And so, as you leave Tlatelolco, the question lingers. What makes a society endure? Its temples and warriors, or its markets of salt, chili and maize? Perhaps it is the markets, where daily life, though overlooked, held the true strength of empire.